All right, so we just defined markets. Um, but what are different kinds of markets? Let's talk about them. Okay, so there are multiple types of market structures. Okay, and as I hinted, they're largely defined based on how many producers and how many consumers you have in the market, how many buyers, how many sellers. Okay, and that'll change the relative strength of the buyer versus the seller. If there's a lot of people like you in a market um, competing for the same things, um, so if you're selling your labor in exchange for compensation, if you're a worker, and there are a lot of other workers who are like you, then you would expect um, to earn. You'd expect to be competing your wage down with other people, right? If you really need a job, you'd accept a lower wage um, relative to the other person, and then the other person, if they really need the job, they'll push push their wage down below yours until eventually, you're pricing it exactly. If there's enough people, until you're pricing exactly at your economic cost. Um, so that is, how kind of like strength in a market is defined. Did quotation strength in a market, or power in a market is kind of reliant on the number of buyers and sellers in it. So let's talk about them. All right. So all it's doing is drawing little dots. Okay, different market structures can affect price competition differently. Okay, so in perfect competition, what does this sound like? It sounds like there's a lot of competitors, right? So in a market where there's perfect competition, basically this is the scenario where you have 1,000 different halal food truck people outside your door. You have the option to pick any one of them. If one person raises their price above the rest of them, so that they're all charging at the same price, and one person unilaterally raises their price, you'd expect their whole line to just move out and go to uh, a different food truck. And if one person lowers their price, well, then you'd expect all the other lines to line up in this food truck. Obviously the opportunity cost of your time, though, might limit how many people exactly line up. But you know what I'm saying. You catch what I'm saying is that if the price is lower in a perfectly competitive market, then all of the consumers would want to purchase that particular product. And if the price is even a cent above the market price, then none of the consumers will. Um, so that's how price competition or perfect competition works. Um, no individual food truck company has the ability to change the price because there's so many food truck companies. The price is set by the market, and it's very difficult to change that. The things that could change it is, let's say half of the food truck companies go bankrupt in one day, so that the supply is contracted now. Then you're not really in perfect competition, though. Or maybe you're still in perfect competition, but the price is increased. Um, but if enough of the food truck companies go away, and you only have like 10 food truck companies, then it's probably not perfect competition. Okay, so perfect competition, there's many sellers. They don't really have a say in how the price is set. The price is set by the number of sellers that there is in the market. Like I said, if one person tries to change the price, then they'll either gain all the consumers or they'll lose all the consumers. And eventually, if let's say the price was $6 and it really cost me $5, including opportunity costs. If it cost me explicitly and opportunity wise $5 to produce a lamb over rice or whatever, then maybe someone, if it's currently $6, maybe someone sets it $5.99. They get all the consumers. So then people are like, no, I want to set mine to $5.98, get all the consumers. They keep doing that until the price is exactly your economic cost. Okay, and I'm going to stop using the phrase economic cost because I want you to just think of that as cost. Okay, so cost already includes opportunity cost. Excuse me. Okay. Monopoly is the exact opposite. Instead of being many sellers, monopoly is the case where there's only one seller. Okay. And that seller can basically sell whatever price that they want. Okay. So if that seller wants to, be generous and set a low price, they can do that. If that's where their utility is, if their utility function includes being kind to others, or if they want to maximize profits, which most public companies do because they rely on shareholders. To keep the CEOs rely on the shareholders to keep their jobs, and the shareholders rely on company profits being paid out every once in a while. Then, so if that's the case, then they would probably set the price that maximizes profits. So essentially, if you're a monopoly, you pretty much have a say in what goes. So I don't want to use cable again. I guess I'm going to use cable again. So the cable industry. So a lot of providers are kind of the only game in town. Some places have Comcast and FiOS and Cox and Spectrum and whatever. But a lot of places will only have one of those. So if that's the case, and if you really need internet, which most people do, the amount by which you can pay for, the amount which you would pay for internet is really high. And a monopolist will know that, and they'll probably set a high price for that internet, even though it's well above the cost of their production. And that's just kind of how it goes. And then, you might ask why we allow monopolies. Some of it is just because there are certain markets where the amount of profits that can be made can only sustain one company. So think of like a high cost industry, a high fixed cost industry in particular. So if you're running, like a cable provider would, cable across a city, it's really expensive to do that, such that the fixed cost, the cost to just get your cable company to be functional is really high. And if there are two companies competing in that particular market, it might be the case that prices will drop to an extent that it doesn't justify paying the cost up front for the second party, for the second company entering the market. Okay. Sometimes there are network effects that will cause a monopoly. So think about the USFL, NFL example. By virtue of having better players, you are increasing the quality of the game. If you're diluting the number of good players by having a lot of bad players, the game will probably look pretty bad. It will probably be a worse product. Okay. So in that sense, the potential for additional profit, when you incur the cost of acquiring other companies or the cost of competing for other companies in that same space, justifies the cost. Another example of like a network monopoly, and this is kind of fading, or maybe not, but when everybody was on MySpace, for those of you who remember MySpace was like pre-Facebook. When everybody was on MySpace, and even before that, Friendster, which is before my time, but when everybody was on MySpace, MySpace's product was connection, right? It was a network, a social network, a literal network. Okay, So by virtue of having everybody on MySpace, the product increased its quality. When people started joining Facebook and people stopped joining MySpace, what happened to MySpace? The quality of its product decreased, because if the product is connection and you can't connect to your friend because your friend's on another network, the quality of the product drops. So individual consumers get less utility from the product, so they'll actually go to a competitor. If I'm MySpace, what I would do is I would invest in the short run to either buy out Facebook or compete against Facebook so that I retain my network. Okay. This is also like, you also see networking effects when you're like the sole person with an Android and an iPhone group chat, and everybody else has to have those little green text messages while you get the blue ones. Or, well, everybody gets the green text messages because of you. So they might kick you out of the group chat so that they get the blue text messages. Like, by virtue of there being a network, you can see benefits from that network. So anyway, like, that would be another reason why there might be a monopoly, so that we can get the benefits of networks, which have what we call externalities, which again I'll define in lecture 2, or the next lecture. So I talked about natural monopolies where there's a high fixed cost, and entering as a second company will be hard to do. Then I talked about networking effects. The third would be government-induced monopoly. So imagine you're a pharmaceutical company, and you are researching the COVID vaccine, right? In order to do so, you're incurring a high fixed cost, right? AstraZeneca and, like, I don't know who else, Pfizer and Oxford University, or was it Cambridge? I don't know. But all those companies are basically competing to be the first person or first company or whatever, first institution to have a vaccine, right? And whoever does, if there were no, patent for it, whoever gets the vaccine will immediately put a patent on it, right? If there were no patent for it, basically, so let's say AstraZeneca is the first past the finish line, and Pfizer sees AstraZeneca's formula. What they're going to do is they're going to copy the formula, and they're going to produce the same drug, the same vaccine, at a lower price, right? And basically what that'll do is that'll erode the fixed costs that AstraZeneca incurred in production. So without a patent, essentially, if you take it a step back, if I know that I'm not going to see any benefit from my fixed cost, because the profit will immediately go down to zero, as though it was perfect competition. If I know that, then I'm not going to incur the fixed cost. I'm going to stop before, I even get started. Okay. Whereas if I know that I'll see a profit with some probability that I'm the first, then I'll weigh that against my fixed cost. Of course, as a side note, I expect that most companies will end up producing the COVID vaccine at a loss, because one, I think there's a high branding opportunity for that. Whoever is the first to produce is going to look like, I'm the champion of pharmaceuticals. So they'll probably see like a share price bump in that. And two, I think that they'll probably just do it because it's a terrible disease, and they're probably actually building altruism into their utility in this case because it's such a unique scenario. So there are examples where monopolies occur in real life. natural monopolies where there's high fixed costs and not enough potential profit to justify it for a second entrant. Social network, or sorry, I shouldn't say social network, networking monopolies where the quality of the good increases the more consumers for that particular good, so that drives away competition. And then government-induced monopolies, which would be like patents, which basically allow for companies to incur a fixed cost so that they know that because they know that they will eventually see some sort of return with some probability. Okay. Otherwise, they would never engage in those fixed costs. Okay. The next market is monopsony. This is, relatively less frequent. The only example I think that anybody ever gives for monopsony is that, so monopsony is that when there's only one buyer and they have an effect on price. Okay. And the only example I've ever seen for monopsony is, or maybe not the only example, but the biggest example is when there's a government contract. So the government wants to buy, a certain number of fighter jets or missiles or whatever it is. What they'll do is, or maybe they're in trying to build a road and they're privatizing who gets the ability to build it. So what the government will do is they'll say, okay, I'm going to sign a contract with one company, but each person send me your bids. So they'll all set an auction, and whoever has the lowest price, justified by the level of quality work that they're going to do, can pretty much get the contract, right? But there's one buyer, the government, and they're basically affecting price because they're saying, relative to the quality of the good that you're selling, I want you guys to compete so that I can get the best deal. And oftentimes there's specific like kind of like anti-corruption laws in place where the government almost has to accept the lowest price unless they can justify like a severe bump in quality, or if it's to meet an affirmative action quota. So they might want to contract with a certain number of black-owned businesses or something like that. That's a case where they can kind of get around the lowest price relative to quality bidder. Okay. Monopolistic competition is pretty important. Monopolistic competition is when there's many differentiated goods. So there might be a lot of sellers, but they're all selling something that's a little bit different than each other. So think about when you go out to eat. Okay, you could go to the Olive Garden, you can go to the Five Guys, you can go to the, Muscle Maker Grill or whatever. You can go to Boston Market, you name it. Each thing, if you consider the market to be the market for things I want to eat right now, each thing is a little bit different. I'm getting Italian, I'm getting, American, I'm getting chicken, which is, I guess, whatever. Boston would be American, I guess. I'm getting burgers, I'm getting whatever. Okay, each thing's a little bit different, but not different enough that Boston Market can suddenly raise their prices to $100 the way that a monopolist could. Okay, they have some say over their price because they're a little bit different than Subway. They're both selling chicken, but the chicken that Subway sells is vastly inferior to the chicken that Boston Market sells. That's an opinion. Don't if you work for Subway or if you're a Subway franchisee, don't get mad at me. I'm just stating my opinion. But so in that case, Boston Market might be able to justify a price increase because their chicken's a little different, and people have different demands for Boston Market versus Subway. But if Boston Market doubled their price, then people would probably consume a lot less Boston Market, a lot more Subway. Or like you could consider like jeans, like Lucky Brand jeans is pretty expensive, but like I don't know, American Eagle or Jinko or whatever. I don't know what jeans are. I just buy the Target brand jeans that I like. But, you know, some people are price sensitive about jeans. Some people are not. Some people are, care a lot about the brand of their jeans. Some people do not. So the range in which you can increase price is there, but it's probably not as big as it would be in Monopoly. But it's also not as small or non-existent as it would be in perfect competition. So consider monopolistic competition to be a mix of monopoly and perfect competition. It's in the name. Okay. So many goods, they're still competing, but they're, kind of competing with some things and kind of not competing with other things. So like, you know, in the car market, or car's not a good example because there's only a few. And like in the food example, Olive Garden's probably competing more with, your local Italian restaurant than it's competing with your local Chinese food place, right? And your Chinese food place is probably competing more with your McDonald's than it's competing with your local, like your, local prestige restaurant. Okay, so there's varying degrees by which they compete, and all this kind of depends on what you set as the market. Is the market Chinese food? In which case, I would argue that Chinese food is almost perfectly competitive because I can't really tell. I'm talking like corner store Chinese food. I can't really tell one place is lo mein apart from another place is lo mein. They all pretty much taste the same to me. Of course, if you go to like a high-end Chinese restaurant, it's different. So if the example is, if the market is, $5 lo mein producers, then, it's probably more along the lines of perfectly competitive. If the market is things I want to eat, then it's probably along the lines of more monopolistic competition. Okay, so where you draw the line in your market matters, and it's generally kind of arbitrary, depending on like what the focus of whatever you're researching or looking at it or considering is. Okay. All right, and then you have oligopoly, which is the hardest one to pronounce by far. Oligopoly is, it's got the same poly in it. Poly comes from the Greek word for polis, I think, which means city. I don't know why I told you that. It's actually not really relevant. The bigger, so, and that's probably not even true. Don't quote me on my Greek. I took it in high school like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I don't know. How old am I? I took it a while ago because I'm old. Okay. Oligopoly. Olig means a few. Mono means one. Okay. So oligopoly differentiates from, I did the wrong one. Monopoly. Oligopoly is different from monopoly in that oligopoly is a few sellers, monopoly is one seller. Okay, that was way too big a slash. But oligopoly is a few sellers. So I gave a couple examples at some point. I don't remember when. But one of the big ones was beer markets are oligopolistic. Jeez Louise, that's hard to say. So you have Anheuser-Busch InBev is one of them, Miller Coors is the other, and then to a much lesser degree, you have Modelo, which produces Corona, and then you have your kind of microbrews, but a lot of the microbrews nowadays are actually owned by Miller Coors and Anheuser-Busch InBev. So it like, your Blue Moons, your Goose Islands, they're all bought out by now. In fact, yeah, they're all bought out by now. So, what a microbrew is actually, kind of not really the case generally. I shouldn't say generally. There's still plenty that exist, don't get me wrong. But if you're looking at market share, those two companies really, maybe three companies, control the bulk of it. So they pretty much have control over what the beer prices are for at least light beer, and then to a lesser degree, your more crafty beers. Okay, so craft beers might be more along the lines of monopolistically competitive, in that there are probably many craft beer producers. But if we're sticking to beer as a market, it's probably more oligopolistic in that there's only a few really big name beer producers that you can get away, if you're doing a paper on beer production, you can get away with looking at them. So oligopolies produce or compete for prices in different ways, depending on depending on a lot of factors, really. One of there's like kind of really two big models that you look at in early game theory with your oligopolistic competition. One is called Cournot, where they're competing in quantity, and the other is called Bertrand, where they're competing on price. And when you compete on quantity, you're going to lower your price to increase market share, but you're probably not going to compete as strongly on price as you would in what's called a Bertrand, where you're competing directly on price. So it's like if there are two people and one of them selling 1 cent less than you, they get the whole market. Just basically similar to perfect competition. But most markets tend to fall in between, and you can actually rearrange the Bertrand and Cournot models of price and quantity competition to actually, based on different assumptions, get them to look exactly the same. So you can get a Bertrand model that looks like a Cournot model and vice versa. They're just different assumptions that you're making about the quantity competition, basically. But anyway, an oligopoly is where a few sellers are competing, and they're competing in either quantity or price or location or quality, and their strategic interactions matter a lot more. So if I know that Miller Coors is going to change its price, then lower its price, then I'll lower my price. And if Miller Coors knows that I'm going to lower my price in exchange to Miller Coors lowering its price, then it's going to double lower its price, and they reach an equilibrium very quickly. So oligopoly tends to focus more on like game theory type models versus like perfect competition or monopoly or whatever, because the strategic interactions matter a lot more. It looks a lot more like a game. But you don't need to know that just now. We'll go into oligopoly more. Particularly, I have an extra credit assignment where I look at politics and why that's an oligopoly. Because in the American system, we tend to have two parties who are the sellers of politicians, so to speak, and the voters are the buyers of politicians, and they're competing strategically for different votes. And even if you have more than two parties, if you have 5 parties, it's still, I would still consider that oligopoly because there's only a few producers in the market. Other examples of oligopoly are your recording industry and your music industry. Sorry, that's the same thing. Recording industry and your movie industry. There's usually like a big 4, big 5 behind them. Car manufacturers are, considered oligopolistic because there's only a few of them. If you're looking at like big pharma, probably oligopolistic, because even though individual drugs might be a monopoly, and even though large, like when you get to brand name or generic drugs, they might be perfectly competitive. By and large, it's going to be the same 3 or 4 firms that have the bulk of the market share. So if you're talking about any industry where there's only a few firms with the bigger portion of the market share, that's oligopoly.